Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Compulsory voting is fairly rare internationally, but it has a strong level of support in Australia. In this video, I'll explain the arguments for and against compulsory voting, how it works in Australia, and the constitutional issues that it raises. In a representative democracy, we elect people to represent us in a legislature that has the power to make laws that bind us. If we don't support the outcome of an election, we at least accept it as a representation of the will of the majority. But where few people turn out to vote, we risk ending up with parliaments that don't represent the views of the majority, just those on the extremes who are motivated to come out to vote. And we also risk a loss of public legitimacy for the government and its mandate to govern. As those who are poor and marginalised are the least likely to vote, places with low voter turnout tend to end up with politicians who have no incentive to listen to or aid those who are the most disadvantaged. Maximising the participation of people in elections through compulsory voting enhances public acceptance of the legitimacy of the outcome and gives incentive for politicians to listen to the views of the people in all sectors of society. A consequence is that the policies delivered by those elected representatives are more likely to reflect the needs of the entire population rather than be skewed to a particular political base. Another benefit of compulsory voting is that it results in the moderation of policies and pushes political parties towards the centre where they can gain the most votes. In countries without compulsory voting, it is the people on the extremes who are more motivated to vote, and parties therefore develop policies to attract them, creating a hyper-partisan culture. In countries with compulsory voting, politicians do not need to focus on getting out the vote. Around 93% of people will vote in Australia anyway. Now, this allows politicians to focus instead on issues and policies that will attract majority support, including attracting the swinging voters in the middle, who are the ones who change vote from time to time depending upon the policies and performance of politicians. One consequence of compulsory voting is that governments make it as easy as possible to vote. In Australia, voting occurs on a Saturday rather than an ordinary workday, as it does in other countries. This means that people have more free time to go out and vote, and that voting becomes a sort of a festival of democracy. Polling stations are commonly placed in the local schools or halls, and the school parents will usually fundraise by holding cake stalls or second-hand book-stalls, and particularly barbecues. Barbecued sausages are now so ubiquitous on polling day that they are actually known as democracy sausages. Voting is seen as a civic duty, and it brings people together so that we can all complain about the politicians and feel virtuous because we are fulfilling our responsibility as a citizen while we enjoy eating our sausages in bread, democracy sausages. But if you're working on the Saturday, or you're away playing sport, or your religion prevents you from voting on a Saturday, that's fine too. You can do what's known as a pre-poll vote, so an early form of voting in certain polling stations, or you can do a postal vote if you need to. Because Australia has compulsory enrolment as well as compulsory voting, polling officials know how many people are going to vote and where, so they can plan accordingly. When I see the footage of massive lines of Americans queuing in the dark and the cold after work in order to be able to vote, I have to say I'm horrified. Because voting is compulsory here, it's deliberately done in a way that is easy to achieve. Despite these advantages of compulsory voting, some will understandably argue that compulsory voting is anti-democratic. If one compels a vote from a person who genuinely does not wish to vote for any candidate or who has no view as to which candidate is preferable to another, then that is not a genuine democratic choice, and the legitimacy of the result is accordingly undermined. Others would argue, and I'm not including me in this one, that the real issue should be the quality rather than the quantity of the votes. And they would say that the vote of an interested and informed voter is more valuable than the random contributions of the ignorant and the uninterested who are compelled to participate. The conflict here is between two views. On the one hand, that the number of votes should be maximised to enhance the legitimacy of the election and the representation of the people. On the other hand, the argument is that the choice exercised in voting must be genuine and not coerced. And this conflict between the people and choice is one that's also reflected in the constitutional jurisprudence of the High Court, which I'll get to soon. But first, just a little bit of the history about compulsory voting in Australia. Initially, it was enrolment to vote which became compulsory at the federal level in 1912 rather than compulsory voting itself. And it was a response to concerns raised by the Chief Electoral Officer that existing electoral rolls were incorrect and full of irregularities. By requiring all people who were qualified to vote to enrol, the rolls would then become an accurate reflection of the voting population. When this compulsion was criticised in Parliament as the bill was going through, the relevant minister, King O'Malley, said this: "There is compulsory registration of births and deaths without objection, and compulsory vaccination, in regard to which we only occasionally hear any protest. There is compulsory military service throughout the Commonwealth with very few objections, and also compulsory census and statistical returns by individuals. There is compulsory registration of persons practising professions or following certain businesses, and there's compulsory education in every state of the Union. We have compulsory notification of infectious diseases, and we are compelled to comply with the requirements of sewerage boards. How then, under these circumstances, can anyone object to compulsory enrolment?" he asked. Next, the state of Queensland introduced both compulsory enrolment and compulsory voting in 1914, allegedly because the government at the time wanted to compel its disenchanted supporters to come out to vote for it at the next election. Well, it didn't work. They actually lost at the next election. Nonetheless, the practice of compulsory voting was generally accepted by the people. The Commonwealth Parliament flirted with the idea of compulsory voting by introducing it for a referendum that was supposed to be held in 1915. But the referendum didn't take place, so the compulsory voting didn't happen either. The real catalyst for change, however, was the 1922 federal election, which had a low turnout of only 58% of voters. What was striking, however, about that election was that because Queensland had compulsory voting at the state level, this had created a culture of voting that meant that over 82% of Queenslanders had voted in the 1922 federal election. Now, this was 26% higher than in any other state. It showed that compulsion had actually created a norm of civic duty that was accepted by the population. The main political parties, however, were still wary about being seen as being responsible for introducing compulsory voting at the federal level, so instead it was introduced by a backbencher in the Senate as a private member's bill, and then it passed with very little debate and indeed no division. Other states then adopted compulsory voting as well, with South Australia being the last state to do so in 1942. It is now a well-accepted part of Australia's political culture, with opinion polls showing that it retains strong public support. But does compulsory voting actually require a person to cast a valid ballot, a formal ballot. There's some ambiguity about this. Subsection 245(1) of the Commonwealth Electoral Act provides that it shall be the duty of every elector to vote at each election. Subsection 245(15) makes it an offence if an elector fails to vote at an election. A penalty notice of the rather small amount of $20 applies for failing to vote, or if you want to take it to court, then the fine is greater. No offence is committed, however, if an elector has a, quote, valid and sufficient reason, unquote, for failing to vote. And that can be that you were sick on the day, so illness or incapacity, or the belief that he or she has a religious duty to abstain from voting. What does the verb to vote actually mean in section 245? Does it simply mean depositing a ballot in the ballot box? Or is an elector required to mark the ballot paper in a particular manner to satisfy the obligation to vote? The legislation requires an elector to mark his or her vote on the ballot paper and sets out how this shall be done according to the system of preferential voting that's used at the federal level in Australia. Now, this would seem to imply that to vote means to mark a valid vote on the ballot paper and deposit it in the ballot box, or post it, obviously, if it's a postal vote. Judicial views on this point have been inconsistent. There's quite a lot of authority on it. I've written an article on it at some point for those who are interested, but to be honest, the analysis isn't terribly useful. Some have pointed out that the existence of a secret ballot system in Australia, which is known in other parts of the world as the Australian ballot, that means that a person is able to vote informally without the risk of prosecution. If they do not mark their ballot paper at all, or they scrawl rude words on it, as indeed sometimes happens, and yes, I have previously been a polling clerk and read quite a few of them, and they deposit it in the ballot box, in practice they will not be fined, although arguably they have committed an offence, but it's effectively an unenforceable one. In reality, the system operates as a kind of a nudge to complete a valid vote by requiring people to actually lodge the ballot in the ballot box. In this way, it diffuses the anti-democratic argument about being compelled to make a choice when you do not wish to choose any of the alternatives. This ambiguity also serves the role of setting a standard and building a social norm while avoiding oppressive enforcement. In contrast, in South Australia, Section 85(2) of the Electoral Act 1985 explicitly states that an elector who leaves their ballot paper unmarked but otherwise completes the formalities of voting does not breach the law. What is interesting is that in practice, persons who might otherwise not have bothered to vote, when prodded by the law to attend a polling booth, actually do then make a choice and complete a valid vote. Informal voting rates are still relatively low and usually the result of confusion or errors in the sequential numbering of candidates rather than a rejection of voting. For example, at the 2022 federal election, only 3.4% of Senate votes were informal and 5.1% of House of Representatives votes were informal. Ordinarily, only about a third of those informal votes actually involve people leaving the ballot paper blank or scribbling words or drawings on it. Now, for the constitutional bit, because let's face it, there's always a constitutional bit lurking somewhere in these videos. The Commonwealth Constitution does not specify whether voting is to be compulsory or not. That's left to Parliament to decide by enacting legislation. In comparison, by the way, the New South Wales Constitution does provide for compulsory voting. But the Commonwealth Constitution does say in sections 7 and 24 that the houses of the Federal Parliament shall be, quote, directly chosen by the people. Now this leads to two opposing arguments, depending on whether you focus on the word chosen, so choice, or the people. On the one hand, we've seen cases such as Roe and the Electoral Commissioner, where the High Court has recognised a constitutional imperative of maximising the participation of the people in elections. This could lead to an argument that if the law requiring compulsory voting was actually repealed in the future, it would have the effect of reducing the participation of the people in elections, potentially resulting in Houses of Parliament that were not chosen by the people. But in fact, were only chosen by a sector of the people. While this argument has yet to be put and accepted, the three dissenting judges in Roe discussed and rejected it, arguing that compulsory voting is a matter of choice for the Parliament, which would be free to repeal compulsory voting laws in the future if it so chose. On the other hand, the High Court, in developing the constitutional implication of freedom of political communication, has focused on the need for people to be able to make a genuine, informed choice. It could be argued that a compelled vote that does not express the will of the voter is not a genuine choice and is therefore in breach of sections 7 and 24 of the Constitution. So far, this argument about choice has not been accepted by the High Court in cases such as Judd and McKeon, Fadderson and Bridger, and Langer and the Commonwealth. In those cases, it was accepted that Parliament can make laws that require a voter, in order to make a valid vote, to choose by allocating preferences amongst candidates for whom the voter may not wish to vote. In the Judd case, which was quite a while ago now, so back in 1926, 3 judges accepted that to choose means no more than to make a selection between different alternatives that are submitted to you, even if you dislike them all. And they gave as an example the phrase, "I have given thee thy choice of the manner in which thou wilt die." Now, you probably don't want to die at all, and indeed all the methods of dying are bad, but that's still treated as a genuine choice. One way of rationalising both positions would be to recognise the value of a genuine choice by expressly permitting informal voting, while at the same time maximising the participation of the people by requiring them to participate in elections by submitting a ballot, and therefore making an active choice about who to vote for or whether to vote formally or informally. This is effectively the current position due to the fact that electors are not prosecuted for submitting an informal vote. But it could be made clear in the law as it is in South Australia. Indeed, the Indian Supreme Court in 2013 considered that the right to freedom of expression requires that voters be free to vote for none of the above. Now, I can't imagine that a box for none of the above would be put on Australian ballot papers because of the very high risk that none of the above might win various seats in an election. So I can't really see that one happening. Thanks again for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and I hope to see you, as always, next time. Goodbye.